The night Hollywood fell silent. Hollywood in the late 1950s was a city that never slept. Neon lights shimmered across Sunset Boulevard like electric stars. Cadillacs lined the streets outside smoky clubs, where jazz drifted through open doors and laughter echoed until dawn. But inside those clubs, there was an invisible competition. Not the kind written in newspapers. Not the kind producers talked about. This was something deeper. It was a competition of presence. Charisma. Power. The kind of presence that could silence an entire room without saying a word. And in that strange world of smoky stages and velvet curtains, two men carried that power like loaded revolvers. Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. Both were legends. Both were unstoppable performers. But they moved through Hollywood in completely different ways. Sammy Davis Jr. was lightning. Fast, explosive, electric. He could sing, dance, act, and joke all in the same breath. When Sammy walked onto a stage, the room erupted before he even opened his mouth. People expected fireworks, and Sammy delivered them every time. Dean Martin was different. Dean moved slowly, casually, almost lazily. Where Sammy was thunder, Dean was gravity. He didn't rush the moment. He owned it. And that difference was about to create one of the most unforgettable nights Hollywood had ever seen. A stage built for legends. It was a private show, the kind that only the most powerful people in Hollywood even knew existed. The venue was small, only about 200 seats, but every seat was filled with someone who mattered. Studio executives, directors, movie stars, even a few politicians. These were the people who decided careers. And tonight they had come to watch something special. Two performers, two legends, one stage. Not officially a competition, but everyone in the room knew what it really was. Backstage, Sammy Davis Jr. paced the floor. Energy radiated off him like electricity. He adjusted his jacket, checked his shoes, practiced a quick tap step against the wooden floor. Sammy never walked onto a stage unprepared. To him, performing wasn't just a job. It was survival. He had spent his entire life proving he belonged. And every stage was another chance to prove it again. Across the hallway, Dean Martin sat in a chair. A drink rested calmly in his hand. He looked like a man waiting for a bus, not someone about to perform in front of Hollywood's most powerful audience. One of the stage assistants peeked in nervously. "Mr. Martin, 5 minutes." Dean nodded slowly. "Thanks, kid." He didn't stand. He didn't rehearse. He simply took another sip of his drink. Because Dean Martin understood something about stages that very few performers ever learned. The audience didn't just watch confidence. They felt it. Sammy Davis Jr. strikes first. The announcer stepped to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we have a special treat." Applause filled the room. The announcer smiled. "Please welcome the incredible Sammy Davis Jr." The room exploded. Sammy burst onto the stage like a spark hitting gasoline. Music kicked in immediately. His feet started moving before the audience even finished clapping. Tap rhythms bounced across the floor like machine gun fire. Left, right, spin, kick. The audience leaned forward. Sammy's energy was contagious. He sang a fast jazz number while dancing across the stage. Then he shifted into impressions. Frank Sinatra, Humphrey Bogart, even a playful imitation of a studio executive sitting in the front row. The room erupted with laughter. Sammy moved from singing to dancing to storytelling without missing a beat. 30 minutes passed like 10. When Sammy finished his final number, the crowd jumped to their feet. Standing ovation. Thunderous applause. Sammy bowed. Sweat glistened across his forehead. He had done exactly what he always did. He conquered the room. As he walked off stage, A few producers whispered to each other. Hard act to follow. And in many ways, it was. The quiet before Dean Martin. The announcer returned. The applause faded. And now, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dean Martin. The reaction was different. Still loud. Still excited. But calmer. Dean walked slowly onto the stage. No rushing. No dramatic entrance. Just a relaxed stroll and a half smile. He adjusted the microphone, looked around the room, and said nothing. For 10 full seconds. The silence felt strange. The audience waited. Then Dean finally spoke. Sammy works too hard. The crowd burst into laughter. Dean leaned casually against the microphone stand. I don't know how he does all that dancing. Another pause. I get tired just watching. More laughter. Dean hadn't even started singing yet. But the room was already leaning toward him. Because Dean Martin had just done something very few performers could do. He slowed the room down. And once the room slowed down, he owned it. The power of effortless charisma. Dean began to sing. Softly, smoothly, no big movements, no flashy dancing, just a voice that felt like warm whiskey on a cold night. Everybody loves somebody sometime. The audience melted into the sound. Dean didn't push the song. He let it float through the room. After the first verse, he stopped suddenly. Looked at the band. You guys know this one, right? The band laughed. The audience laughed. Dean winked. Good, because I don't. More laughter. He started singing again. But something strange was happening. Sammy Davis Jr. had electrified the room. Dean Martin hypnotized it. The audience wasn't cheering loudly. They were listening. Every word. Every pause. Every small joke. Dean had turned a performance into a conversation. And that was far more powerful. Sammy watches from the shadows. Backstage, Sammy Davis Jr. stood quietly near the curtain. He watched Dean perform. And slowly, a smile spread across his face. Because Sammy understood something most people in that audience didn't. Dean Martin wasn't trying to compete. He was doing something else entirely. He was controlling the rhythm of the room. Where Sammy moved fast, Dean moved slow. Where Sammy dazzled, Dean disarmed. Sammy shook his head slightly. Man, he whispered to himself. That's dangerous. The moment Hollywood realized the truth. Near the end of his set, Dean paused again. He looked toward the curtain where Sammy stood backstage. Then he said something unexpected. You know, Sammy Davis Jr. is the most talented guy I know. The audience applauded. Dean continued. But here's the problem. He paused. I look better doing less. The room exploded with laughter. Even Sammy laughed behind the curtain. Because Dean Martin had just revealed the secret of his charisma. He didn't try to overpower the room. He simply let the room come to him. And that kind of confidence could silence Hollywood. A friendship forged in respect. When the show ended, the two men met backstage. Sammy grinned. You're unbelievable, man. Dean shrugged. I barely did anything. Sammy laughed. That's the scary part. Dean raised his glass slightly. To doing less. Sammy clinked it. To doing it better. And in that quiet moment backstage, something important happened. Not rivalry. Not competition. Respect. Because both men understood something rare about performance, fame, and life. Speed can capture attention, but presence controls it. And Dean Martin had just proven that sometimes the most dangerous charisma in the room is the quietest one. The night Sinatra changed everything. The lights of Las Vegas in the early 1960s were brighter than anywhere else in the world. Not just bright, Blinding, the desert had transformed into something almost unreal. Rows of glowing casinos stretched across the strip like jewels laid across the sand. And inside those casinos, something historic was happening. A new kind of entertainment. A new kind of brotherhood. A new kind of power. The man behind it all was Frank Sinatra. By this time, Sinatra was more than a singer. He was a force, a man who could turn a nightclub into the center of the universe simply by walking into it. And he had a vision, not just a show, a movement, a group of performers who could command every room they entered. He called it nothing at first, but history would later give it a name that became legendary. The Rat Pack, and two of its most unforgettable members were already part of the story. Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. Sinatra's plan. Frank Sinatra didn't believe in ordinary shows. He believed in moments. Moments that people would talk about for decades. Moments that made audiences feel like they were witnessing something that might never happen again. So when Sinatra planned the next series of performances in Las Vegas, he wanted something different. Not just singers performing one after another. He wanted chaos, energy, improvisation, comedy, friendship. He wanted the audience to feel like they were sitting in the room while a group of friends entertained each other. But to make that work, he needed the right personalities. People who could handle unpredictability. People who could hold a stage without trying too hard. That's why Dean Martin was essential. And that's why Sammy Davis Jr. was irreplaceable. They were opposites, but together they created something magical. The first Rat Pack night. The Sands Hotel was overflowing that evening. Word had spread across Vegas. Something unusual was happening tonight. The audience wasn't just tourists. There were Hollywood actors, business tycoons, politicians, even reporters trying to sneak in quietly. Everyone wanted to see what Sinatra was planning. Backstage, the atmosphere was loud and chaotic. Laughter filled the dressing rooms. Jokes bounced between the walls. Cigarette smoke curled toward the ceiling. Frank Sinatra stood in the center of the room like a general preparing his army. "All right, boys," he said with a grin. "Tonight we don't perform." He paused. "We play." Dean Martin leaned against the wall, holding a drink. "Frank, that's the only way I know how." Sammy Davis Jr. laughed. "You two better keep up tonight." Sinatra pointed toward Sammy. "That's what worries me." The curtain rises. The band started playing. The audience roared. Sinatra stepped onto the stage first. The applause was thunderous. He raised his hand, smiling. "Ladies and gentlemen." He paused dramatically. "I brought some friends." Dean Martin walked onto the stage slowly. The cheers grew louder. Then Sammy Davis Jr. joined them. The energy in the room exploded. But something unexpected happened next. They didn't follow a script. There was no strict order. No rigid structure. Instead, they talked. They joked. They interrupted each other. Dean Martin teased Sinatra. Sinatra teased Sammy. Sammy teased everyone. At one point, Dean said casually, "Frank sings like he owns the place." Sinatra smirked. "I do own the place." The audience roared with laughter. It didn't feel like a show. It felt like a private party. And the audience had somehow been invited. Sammy's fire. At one point, Sammy Davis Jr. stepped forward for a solo number. The band kicked into a fast swing rhythm. Sammy danced across the stage like lightning. His feet struck the floor with impossible precision. Spin, tap, slide. The audience gasped at the speed. Sammy's energy filled the entire room. He sang while dancing without losing a single note. Even Sinatra shook his head in amazement. When Sammy finished, the applause was deafening. Dean Martin slowly walked up beside him. He looked out at the crowd, then said calmly, "I'm not following that." The crowd erupted with laughter, but Dean stepped forward anyway. Dean's dangerous calm. Dean Martin didn't try to match Sammy's speed. He didn't dance. He didn't jump around. He simply stood there, relaxed, comfortable. He started singing a slow ballad. The room immediately grew quiet. The contrast was powerful. Sammy's performance had been explosive. Dean's was hypnotic. Every word flowed smoothly through the microphone. Every pause felt intentional. Dean wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was simply being himself. And somehow that made the room lean closer. Sammy watched from the side of the stage. And once again, he whispered the same words he had said before. Dangerous. Because Dean Martin had mastered something rare. He made effort look effortless. And that kind of confidence was magnetic. A moment of tension. But not every moment was smooth. During one show, something unexpected happened. A wealthy businessman sitting near the front made a loud comment towards Sammy Davis Jr. It wasn't friendly, and the room felt the tension immediately. Sammy paused for a moment. The band stopped playing. The room went silent. For a split second, it seemed like the energy of the entire show might collapse. Then Frank Sinatra stepped forward. His voice was calm, but firm. Sammy's family. He pointed toward the audience. If you don't respect family. He paused. You're in the wrong room. The crowd erupted in applause. Dean Martin raised his glass slightly. Sammy smiled quietly. And the music started again. That moment became one of the most talked about stories in Vegas. Because it showed something powerful. The Rat Pack wasn't just entertainment. It was loyalty. The night Vegas changed forever. Over the next few months, the Rat Pack shows became legendary. People flew across the country just to see them. Celebrities crowded the casinos. The energy in Las Vegas felt unstoppable. But what made the shows unforgettable wasn't just the talent. It was the chemistry. Sammy's speed. Dean's calm. Sinatra's leadership. Each man brought something different. And together, they created a balance that felt almost impossible. One night after a performance, the three of them sat quietly backstage. The noise of the casino echoed faintly down the hallway. Sammy looked at Dean. You know something. Dean raised an eyebrow. What's that? Sammy smiled. You're still the most dangerous guy in the room. Dean laughed softly. I barely do anything. Sammy nodded. Exactly. The real secret. Years later, people would ask what made the Rat Pack so special. Was it the music? The comedy? The chemistry? The truth was simpler. Each man understood something most performers never learn. The audience doesn't just watch talent. They feel authenticity. Sammy Davis Jr. performed with unstoppable energy. Dean Martin performed with effortless confidence. And Sinatra brought them together with fearless leadership. Three completely different styles, but one unforgettable presence. And in those glowing nights of Las Vegas, they didn't just entertain the world. They changed it. The night fame almost broke the brotherhood. By the mid-1960s, the Rat Pack had become more than entertainers. They were an empire. Las Vegas casinos filled to capacity every night they appeared. Hollywood studios competed to cast them in films. Magazine covers featured their photographs almost weekly. To the public, the Rat Pack looked unstoppable. But behind the bright lights and roaring applause, something more complicated was slowly building. Pressure. Fame had a strange way of doing that. It lifted people higher than they ever imagined, and then quietly tested the strength of the friendships that brought them there. For Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr., that test was coming. And it would arrive on a night that began like any other performance. but ended in a way none of them expected. A storm beneath the spotlight. The Sands Hotel in Las Vegas was packed again. Crowds filled every seat. The band tuned their instruments. Cocktail glasses clinked across the room. But backstage, the mood felt different. Frank Sinatra paced slowly near the dressing rooms. He had seen this kind of tension before. When people performed together for years, small cracks eventually appeared. Nothing dramatic at first. Just quiet frustrations. Little disagreements. A joke that went too far. A comment that lingered longer than it should. And tonight, Sinatra could feel that tension in the air. Inside one dressing room, Sammy Davis Jr. sat quietly tying his shoes. Usually Sammy was the most energetic person in the building. But tonight he looked focused. Serious. Across the hallway, Dean Martin leaned back in a chair, holding his usual drink. But even Dean seemed quieter than usual. The playful jokes weren't flowing the way they normally did. And Sinatra noticed. He stepped into the hallway and spoke calmly. "All right, boys," he said. "Let's give them a show." Dean smiled slightly. Sammy nodded. But Sinatra knew something the audience didn't. Tonight's performance might be different. The show begins. The curtain opened. The music started. Sinatra walked onto the stage first, greeted by thunderous applause. Dean Martin followed. Then Sammy Davis Jr. The audience cheered louder than ever. From the outside, everything looked perfect. The jokes landed. The songs flowed. The laughter filled the room. But performers noticed things the audience never sees. Sammy noticed Dean skipping a cue during a comedy segment. Dean noticed Sammy changing the rhythm of a musical number. Small things, almost invisible to the crowd. But backstage tension sometimes slips into performances like quiet echoes. And the energy on stage slowly shifted. Still entertaining, still exciting, but slightly unpredictable. And then something happened that no one expected. The joke that went too far. During a comedy segment, Dean Martin leaned toward the microphone. He looked at Sammy with a playful grin. "Sammy works so hard," Dean joked. The crowd chuckled. Dean continued. "He sings, he dances, he does impressions." He paused. "Meanwhile, I just stand here and collect the check." The audience laughed again. But Dean added one more line. "And somehow Sammy still says he's the talented one." The crowd roared. But Sammy didn't laugh. Not right away. For a moment the stage felt oddly quiet. Then Sammy stepped forward slowly. He smiled, but the smile carried a different kind of energy. "Dean's right," Sammy said calmly. "He stands there and sings one song." Sammy paused, and somehow the whole world falls in love. The crowd laughed again. But the tension underneath the moment was real. Both men had built careers on playful teasing. But tonight something felt slightly sharper. Like a guitar string pulled a little too tight. Sinatra noticed it immediately. He stepped between them smoothly and started the next song before the moment could grow heavier. The show continued. But backstage, the atmosphere had changed. After the curtain, when the performance ended, the crowd gave a standing ovation. But backstage was quiet. Sammy removed his jacket and placed it carefully on the chair. Dean sat down slowly. For the first time that evening, neither of them joked. Sinatra walked into the room and closed the door. He looked at both men. "You two finished?" Sammy exhaled. Dean took a slow sip from his glass. Finally, Sammy spoke. "Dean, sometimes it feels like people only see you." Dean raised an eyebrow. "What does that mean?" Sammy leaned forward. "I've spent my whole life proving I belong on that stage." His voice stayed calm. "But sometimes it feels like people expect me to prove it every night." Dean didn't answer immediately. Instead, he set his glass down. "Sammy," he said quietly, "you think I've had it easy." Sammy shook his head. That's not what I'm saying. Dean leaned forward. People think I don't try. They think I'm just lucky. He paused, but staying calm when the whole world is watching. Dean looked directly at him. That's not easy either. The room fell silent. Both men had spoken truths they rarely said out loud. And for a moment the friendship that powered the Rat Pack seemed fragile. Then Sinatra finally stepped in. Sinatra's reminder. Frank Sinatra had always been the glue that held the group together. He understood people. He understood pressure. And he understood pride. He walked slowly between them. You know what the audience saw tonight? Neither Dean nor Sammy answered. Sinatra continued. They saw magic. He pointed toward the stage. You know what they didn't see? He pointed toward the floor. This. Sammy sighed. Dean rubbed his face. Sinatra smiled slightly. You two think you're competing. He shook his head. You're completing each other. He looked at Sammy. You're lightning. Then he looked at Dean. Your gravity. Sinatra paused. And the world needs both. The moment that changed everything. A long silence filled the room. Then Sammy stood up. He walked over to Dean and held out his hand. Dean looked at it for a second. Then he laughed softly. You're still too fast for me, Sammy. Sammy grinned. And you're still too relaxed. Dean shook his hand. The tension dissolved instantly. Sinatra nodded. That's better. Because the truth was simple. Great performers can compete. But great friends learn something more powerful. Respect. A lesson hidden in fame. Years later, people would remember the Rat Pack as a group of unstoppable entertainers. But the real story behind their success was deeper. They were different. Dean Martin moved through life with calm confidence. Sammy Davis Jr. attacked every moment with explosive energy. Sinatra led them both with fearless determination. 3 personalities. 3 styles. 1 brotherhood. And on that night in Las Vegas, when fame nearly pushed them apart, they remembered something important. The stage might belong to individuals, but the magic belongs to the connection between them, the final night that left Hollywood silent. By the late 1980s, the world had changed. Las Vegas was still bright, still loud, still alive with music and flashing lights. But the era that once belonged to the Rat Pack had slowly begun to fade. The neon signs were the same. The casinos were still full. But something important had shifted. The golden years of Sinatra, Dean Martin, and Sammy Davis Jr. were no longer the present. They had become legends. Stories people told. Memories that older performers shared with younger ones who could hardly believe what those nights must have felt like. And yet, on one quiet evening, something extraordinary was about to happen. A reunion. A moment no one expected. And it would become one of the most emotional nights Hollywood had ever witnessed. The idea that started it all. The plan came from Frank Sinatra. Even after decades of success, Sinatra still understood one thing better than anyone else. People never forget authenticity. And the Rat Pack had always been exactly that. Real friends. Real personalities. Real moments. So Sinatra proposed something special. One more show. Not a tour. Not a comeback. Just a single night. A celebration of the years they had shared together. The idea spread quickly through Hollywood. Within days, everyone was talking about it. Actors, directors, musicians, old fans who had once traveled across the country just to see them perform together. Tickets became the most valuable item in Las Vegas. Everyone wanted to be there, because people knew something important. Moments like this rarely happened twice. A different kind of backstage. On the night of the show, the theater was filled beyond capacity. Some people even stood along the walls. But backstage, The atmosphere felt very different from the loud dressing rooms of the past. Time had softened the chaos. There were fewer jokes, fewer cigarettes, less noise. Age had slowed things down, but it had also deepened something else. Perspective. Dean Martin sat quietly in his chair, looking toward the mirror. His famous relaxed smile still appeared from time to time, but tonight his eyes carried memories. Across the room, Sammy Davis Jr. stretched his shoulders carefully. Even after years of performing, Sammy still carried that familiar spark of energy. But now it was paired with wisdom. And Sinatra stood near the doorway, watching both of them. For a moment, he didn't speak. He simply looked at the two men who had shared the stage with him for decades. Friends, brothers, partners in one of the greatest entertainment eras the world had ever seen. Finally, Sinatra broke the silence. "Well, boys," he said quietly, "one more night." Dean lifted his glass slightly. "Let's not mess it up." Sammy laughed. "You're the one who never rehearses." Dean shrugged. "Worked so far." And just like that, the old rhythm returned. The audience waits. Out in the theater, the audience buzzed with anticipation. People whispered to each other. Some had seen the Rat Pack perform decades earlier. Others had only heard the stories. But everyone understood something special was about to happen. The lights dimmed slowly. The band began playing the familiar opening notes. And the room fell silent. Then the curtain opened. Frank Sinatra walked onto the stage. The applause began immediately. But it wasn't just applause. It was gratitude. The kind of applause given to someone who had shaped an entire generation of music and entertainment. Sinatra raised his hand. The crowd slowly quieted. He looked around the room. Then he smiled. "I brought a couple friends tonight." The audience erupted. The reunion. Dean Martin walked onto the stage first. The cheers grew louder. Then Sammy Davis Jr. joined them. For a moment, none of them spoke. They simply stood there together. Three men who had changed entertainment forever. Three friends who had shared thousands of nights on stage. The applause lasted nearly a full minute. Finally, Dean stepped toward the microphone. He looked at the audience and said calmly, "I hope you all remember the songs, because we forgot the rehearsal." The crowd burst into laughter. Sammy shook his head. "That's Dean's way of saying we didn't rehearse." Dean smiled. Sammy rehearsed. More laughter. The tension disappeared. And the magic returned. The performance that felt like time travel. The band began playing. One by one, the familiar songs filled the room. Sinatra sang with his timeless confidence. Sammy performed with his signature spark. Dean delivered his smooth, effortless melodies. Something incredible happened during that show. It felt like time itself had stepped aside. The audience wasn't just watching a performance. They were reliving an era. Every joke felt familiar. Every song carried memories. People in the crowd wiped tears from their eyes between smiles. Because they understood something powerful. This wasn't just entertainment. It was history. The moment that stopped the room. Near the end of the show, something unexpected happened. The band finished a song. The applause faded. Dean Martin stepped forward slowly. He looked toward Sammy. Then he spoke. "You know something." The room grew quiet. Dean continued. "All these years people keep asking me the same question." He paused. "They ask who's the most talented guy in the Rat Pack." The audience leaned forward. Dean smiled. "And I always give the same answer." He turned toward Sammy. "This guy." The room erupted with applause. Sammy shook his head. But Dean wasn't finished. "You sing better than me." He pointed at Sammy. "You dance better than me." More applause. Dean raised his glass slightly. "And you work a lot harder than me." The crowd laughed. Then Dean added softly, "But the real reason you're special." He paused, "is because you never stopped believing you belonged on that stage." The room went silent. Sammy looked at Dean with genuine emotion. For a moment, he couldn't speak. Then he finally said quietly, "Dean, the truth is..." He paused. "You made it look easy for all of us." The final song. Sinatra stepped forward and placed a hand on both of their shoulders. "Well," he said with a smile, "before we all start crying." The band began playing the final song. A slow, emotional melody. All three of them sang together. Not perfectly, not with the polished precision of younger performers, but with something far more powerful. History, friendship, and gratitude. When the final note faded, the audience stood instantly. The applause lasted longer than any performance that night. People knew they had witnessed something unforgettable. Not just a show, but the closing chapter of an era. The legacy they left behind. Years later, people would still talk about that final night. Not because it was the most technically perfect performance, but because it reminded everyone of something important. Great performers may shine individually, but the greatest moments happen when talent, respect, and friendship share the same stage. Dean Martin taught the world the power of calm confidence. Sammy Davis Jr. showed the unstoppable force of passion and determination. Frank Sinatra proved that leadership could turn talent into history. Together, they created something larger than fame. They created a legacy. And on that final night in Las Vegas, Hollywood didn't just applaud. It listened. And for a brief moment, the entire room fell silent. Not because the music had stopped, but because the story had come full circle.